Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the EACC's webinar on the quarterly EU economic update, a reliable partnership in an uncertain world. The event today is organized by the EACC New York in collaboration with the EU Commission. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the EACC, and I will be your host and moderator for today's event. My conversation partners include Ben Carlina. He's a senior economist at the European Delegation to the United States. And Willem Koy, he's a counselor for economic and financial affairs, also at the EU Delegation to the U.S. Both are joining us from Washington today. Maybe we should do this event together, sitting in the same room, no? One day.
It's always fun to be here, Yvonne.
Yeah, great to be here.
Focus topics for today are what the EU is doing to accelerate its global competitiveness. We will be discussing energy market, defense spending, and the fiscal outlook for the EU. And with that, let's get right into it. After recovering from the shocks of COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the global economic growth is being challenged by a new risk factor that we added to the mix, escalating trade tensions and a shift in policy priorities on the side of the United States. And with that, staying the course of reforms and simplifying regulations, should I put it, the EU is marching on their own policy priorities and working on increasing productivity, growth, and adding flexibility to make investments in defense, energy, new technology, simplifying regulation, and a number of other policy measures that we will be addressing as we go through our program. But I want to start with how we started at the beginning of the year and where we were and where we are now. So with the sweeping tariff hikes that the U.S. announced on the 2nd of April, we encountered shockwaves that were going through the global economy. Some of the tariffs were scaled back. Others are still in negotiation, but the EU, nevertheless, is feeling the strain on the effects of these tariffs and the uncertainty. And Ben, can you talk a little bit? I know you have some data points on this, on the uncertainty indices, both in Europe and the U.S., and just give us a broader picture on what we're dealing with in the markets.
Absolutely, Yvonne. As you know, the EU never lets a crisis go to waste, and this is not going to be the same thing this time around. Maybe just to set the stage a little bit, before we had this sort of tariff shock coming out of the U.S., the EU economy was in pretty good shape. We've been saying the word resilient a lot, but I think it's very apt. There have been a lot of shocks that the EU economy has had to deal with over the past few years. First COVID, then the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And finally, growth was picking up in Europe. In last year, we had growth in the EU, GDP growth of about 1%, which is not great, but it's pretty good. Especially when you consider the disinflationary environment that was happening under. But then really what happened was you had this announcement. I mean, it began before April 2nd, but this announcement was quite a big deal from the U.S. We've got, we don't know exactly what the landing zone is going to be, but the average tariff rates that we end up with in the U.S. are going to be higher than at any point since the 1930s and the Smoot-Hawley era. So we're going to end up with significantly higher tariffs than before. And it's a little bit difficult to understand what the economic and political logic of this is, but nonetheless, what the EU wants is to make a deal with the U.S. The EU is not going to give up on its most important partnership. The economic and trade relationship between the EU and the U.S. is the most important in the world. There's lots of goods and services trade. U.S. and Europe are each other's largest source and destination for foreign direct investment. So this is just too important a relationship to risk damaging, and the EU is not going to. But one of the things that I want to emphasize just right off the bat for everybody is that one of the interesting things about this new spring forecast that the Commission has published is that one of the main findings is that while higher tariffs will hurt the global economy, they're bad for everybody. It's the U.S. that's actually going to suffer the largest hit to growth. It's not Europe, it's not China, it's the U.S. And ultimately the reason is because tariffs are taxes, and at the end of the day, U.S. consumers are ultimately going to pay most of that cost. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this, the Commission's forecast expects that U.S. growth this year in 2025 will be 0.8% lower than it otherwise would have been without the tariffs. Next year, growth in the U.S. is going to be 1.3% lower. That compares to a hit to EU growth of 0.2% in both years. Now, I should also maybe mention a couple of the assumptions behind these numbers. These figures assume a 10% across the board tariff plus higher, about 25% sectoral tariffs on a couple of key sectors like autos and pharmaceuticals, and also a higher tariff on China. I think it was just a technical assumption that U.S. tariffs on China would end up at 54%. But it does not include any retaliation from Europe. It's just the U.S. tariffs.
Can we dive into this a little bit further and put the relationship together between tariffs, the increase in prices of industrial goods, services? I mean, it's like the dependency of the EU. If I remember that correctly, the EU has an advantage by not being as dependent on the US due to its large internal market. So do I have my numbers correct that only 20% of EU output is traded with the US, or what was that number again? And 80% internally, is that correct? Or
I think that's too high. Willem, do you know what the number is there?
It seems a bit indeed on the high side, but you do make a very good point about the internal market there and the potential of the internal market. Indeed, but we don't expect so much impact actually from the tariffs also on inflation, for instance, if you look at that. So indeed, there's a muted impact on top of what Ben said about the 0.2%. We expect an impact through the increased uncertainty. So the forecast has been lowered slightly more because more will have to come from domestic demand in the years ahead. Still, investment is expected to be relatively strong. So consumption and investments are the drivers of growth in the years ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the EU is a more open economy in general than the United States is, and so I don't want to pretend that the decline in global trade that is forecast to happen because of these tariffs isn't going to hurt the EU. If you look at the chart that I put up on the screen right now, you can see that every of the major GDP components is going to be contributing to growth over the next 2 years, except for net exports, except for trade. Trade is going to be a drag on growth in Europe. If the assumptions hold about what the ultimate tariff levels are going to be, there's probably going to be about a 0.5% hit to EU growth because of lower trade and explicitly lower external demand. But as you point out, there's a couple of things here. One is that the single market is, the EU's biggest asset in terms of its economic strength and power in global markets. And so the EU is in the process of rolling out a number of key reforms that are going to strengthen the single market and make it a more, attractive place to do business and invest. But the other thing is, just talking about trade, the EU has the potential to if US tariffs are higher on China than they are versus European exports, European companies could stand to benefit by the US buying more stuff from Europe instead of China. So there is some scope for a reallocation of trade that will help European companies.
Yeah, for sure. We discussed that in our transatlantic trade monitor. There's going to be inevitably some, I call it tariff Tetris going on, where people are trying to rearrange manufacturing, co-manufacturing, and supply chain in small pieces to see how they can take some, offset some of the cost. Let's talk a little bit about consumption, government and consumer consumption in Europe. How is that developing?
Absolutely. So I mean, just to give you a couple of top line numbers, the forecast expects EU GDP to expand by 1.1% this year and 1.5% in 2026. So, stable, moderate growth and an acceleration from what we got last year. And this is happening despite the tariff shock. And, the big part of there's two big reasons for that is public investment and private consumption. Both of those are going to increase a bit. And maybe we should emphasize private consumption here now, because that is really the key thing that's been driving growth. Europe has, we'll come back to this, but like very strong labor market, real incomes have been growing, real disposable income is up, and that is going to boost consumption. Now, one of the other things that I'd like to add is that apart from the tariffs themselves, one of the major impacts of everything that's coming out of US policy is just uncertainty. And uncertainty is difficult to quantify, but it's damaging to two things in particular. One is corporate CapEx. So businesses find it difficult to make major investment decisions when they're so unsure about what the policy environment's going to look like in a couple of years. And secondly, consumers sometimes get worried and they think, maybe I should save more money and not splurge on that big holiday or that big new car or whatever major purchase they're thinking of. So uncertainty is going to be a drag on growth, particularly in the short term. But on the other hand, this also represents one of the advantages Europe has, because Europe has very high personal savings rates. And assuming that we can get over this initial round of uncertainty and insecurity about things, there's a lot of money waiting on the sidelines, waiting to be invested. And I think that's one of the positives here.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the savings rate remains a problem, and I don't know how we're going to tackle that. I mean, we have the savings and investment union policies being implemented, but I think that will take a little bit to really make a dent. But what about all of the investments that the European Commission authorized the EIB in collaboration, obviously, with the member states, at the investments that the EIB is doing in the energy sector, in infrastructure, and other in Rearm Europe, I think is the other initiative. Is that going to help corporate investment to loosen a little bit by putting some public money against that?
Yeah, I think you're making a great point about so to say the combined effort of public and private investments. We've had this initiative called Next Generation EU, of which 90% was the recovery fund, and which is a big chunk also of investments, and will be continue to be a big chunk of investments into the 2026 when it ends when the RRF ends, and it's projected to be about 0.5% of public investment. Now, on top of that, you have different leveraging opportunities in Europe. One of the examples is the defense. So the Readiness 2030, now called Readiness 2030. It was rearm before, but readiness sounds more positive, I suppose. And there, for instance, there is the EU instrument which can be lifted up to 150 billion with private coming into the incentives. This is also happening in other parts. So we've had this there's an increasing use of this leveraging and bringing in the private sector in the EU. So this is what they call the safe instrument in defense.
Yeah, in fact, Yvonne, I think it's worth emphasizing that, after April 2, there was a big market sell-off. We saw a big downturn in stock markets. We saw a big move up in U.S. Treasury yields. And what that tells you is that the markets they don't like trade wars, and they don't like high tariffs. And so I think you have a lot of investors around the world who are unsure about what's happening in the United States. And it's not just trade policy, it's also the fiscal sustainability of what's going on in the U.S. And it's worrying people, and investors are looking for, a safer place to put their money and that has like growth opportunities. And so this is an opportunity for Europe. And Europe, I think policymakers understand that this doesn't, there's still structural issues in the European economy that need to be addressed. But this is what we mean when we say that Europe isn't going to let a crisis go to waste. Europe has always been forged in crises. There's major policy advances that happen every time there's a crisis. The Recovery and Resilience Facility was originally created to deal with COVID. Then it was adapted to deal with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And all of these things that we're talking about are some of them are coming up in response to this new challenge. And we've already talked in the past a bit about the Draghi and the letter reports that focused on the need for Europe to improve its competitiveness and make some tough decisions.
We get to that in a minute, so don't.
I just want to say that
Yeah.
This is one of those moments where it's hard to make these reforms, but crises help focus minds.
Yeah. And it's not only that. I mean, what I want to point out is also, we have a reform, we put ourselves on a better level. And then, we're adding. We're not always going down to the same level and starting from scratch with a new set of reforms. But let's stick around on the great growth picture for a minute. Just briefly, energy costs and commodity prices and their effects on inflation or the lack thereof. Just a few words to wrap up that sector.
Sure. Hold on. Let me here.
You got a nice slide on that one. Yeah.
So I mean, the big thing is energy prices are coming down, right? And there's a lot of reasons for this, but partly it is the negative impact of tariffs on global growth means that there's going to be less demand for energy relative if growth was higher. So energy prices have come down a lot, and that's a big chunk of why the inflation forecast is coming down so much. And maybe this feeds into some of where we're going to go on some of the energy reforms. I don't know, Willem, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Happy to dwell on that already. One of these things, and as you both alluded to, is this internal market. It's our asset, but it's an asset that can still grow. And one of those things that can still grow is the energy union. I don't know whether we have that slide, Ben, on the price dispersion within the EU compared to the US, where you can
Yeah,
see.
this one.
Yeah, that one. So this is work done by the IMF on request by the European Council, just to inform them of what would it bring, what could it bring if we would be able to have more of an integrated energy union. And indeed, that is the savings could be massive. I mean, we're talking about already 130 billion annually by 2030. So that is really a massive push that or carrots, a bag of carrots almost at the end, that we could reap. And there are things have been done. And I mean, you also allude to the sometimes we grow by the crisis, but sometimes we also have a kind of good idea of where we want to land. Because, for instance, in the Baltics, in 2030 there was 13. There was already an idea that you had they would need to come off the Russian grid, and would we need to integrate into the European grid. And actually, now on the 9th of February of this year, actually the Baltics got away from the Russian grid and became independent from the Russian grid, and were able to integrate into the European grid. So yeah, so there's much going on in the energy sector. And there's still much more to be done. And what you're showing here is actually what are the ongoing cross-border projects. Because the issue is that what we have in the EU is still a too fragmented energy market, and so we need to invest. And there are just a few examples here. The map on the left shows how big this is, and if you then zoom in on the northeast, for instance, or on the southeast, on the central west, you can see what is happening. Green is electricity, blue is that one I have to look up. But so there is yellow is gas. For instance, we have the southeast gas corridor, where we are tapping into the gas fields in Cyprus, Israel, Cyprus and Israel and Egypt have. So there's massive investment going on that should improve the energy market. And also, I mean, in general, of course, I mean, energy is a bit of our weakness, because we're a big importer, right? I mean, 2/3 of our imports are actually, or 2/3 of our energy consumption is actually imports. So that is massive. So that is also, of course, I mean, renewable energy, for instance. I mean, that is to Europe, that is a real gain. Not just because we are into the green transition, but also because it's a source that we produce ourselves, an energy source that we can produce ourselves.
And I was just going to ask that exact question. So what you're showing here is just the benefit from the integration. That doesn't even show the raising the percentage of renewable energy sources that is created within the European Union.
No, exactly. I mean, so this is a combination of moving to renewable energies and also securing energy supply.
Also, just to add, I think it's worth pointing out that, the benefit of this is not just lower inflation. Lower energy prices directly improve the competitiveness of a lot of European businesses. There's been weakness in energy-intensive manufacturing ever since the invasion of Ukraine, that was caused by this big spike in energy prices. And even after like the main crisis was over and energy prices had come down a lot, the price of electricity and natural gas in Europe was still something like 3 times what it was in the United States. And so this was a real issue for European corporates. And while it's strategically a good idea apart from the environmental factors, to have more renewable energy that the EU does not have to import. One of the silver linings of all this stuff that we've been talking about is that Europe's terms of trade are actually improving right now. So lower energy prices, cheaper industrial goods imports, and a stronger euro all improve European purchasing power, right? It means that Europe is paying less for its imports. And this is a positive, a clear positive for European growth.
Yeah, and let me stay on this tack before we get to the integration of the capital markets. This whole mix that you just described, combined also with new trade partnerships. So we have CETA, we have Mercosur that just came online. I think it was December last year. How is that affecting the economy? How is that affecting trade opportunities for the European companies and European Union?
Well, I think first of all, it's an indication that Europe remains committed to the rules-based international order and engaging in mutually beneficial negotiations with all of its international partners. The EU is trying to reach a deal with the United States, and I anticipate that there will be a deal ultimately. But at the same time, it's working to increase the number of trade agreements it has. I think the EU already has trade agreements with 76 countries. And like you mentioned, there's this new deal with Mercosur that was just negotiated. There's a deal. They're negotiating with the Brits to improve relations following Brexit. But all of these agreements, they stay within WTO rules. They acknowledge that it's good to have these international institutions in place that provide stability and provide legal frameworks for, what countries are going to do and what tariff regimes and safety and health and regulate things like that are going to be. And that gives businesses the confidence to invest. And I think that's a key aspect here.
Yeah, I mean, hence the reason you have a trade agreement. I mean, isn't that what it's all about?
Right, exactly.
Capital markets integration. I mean, we changed it from the Capital Markets Union to the Savings and Investment Union. Do you want to spend a minute or so on that, or is that with the simplification of regulation still
This is
too much of a moving target?
Go ahead, Willem.
Yeah. So this is one of those things that we were talking about, right? I mean, about pressure on the EU, and it's a project that's been coming for long. The Capital Markets Union, the Savings and Investment Union, and there's now pressure, and there will be new proposals circulating this year still. For instance, on allowing retail savers, so to say, to use their deposits rather for productive investment, maybe more like to what you would call 401. No, sorry. That is the other one thing that is, so to say, also looking at the supplementary pensions on bringing them more in line, or what you would call here 401k plans, so to say. So that it would be more risk taking, which is a bit of the issue in the EU generally, that you would like them to be more risk takers rather than keeping it just on the bank. And that is the whole idea behind all this. Also, for instance, we have something coming up on improving the securitization and fine-tuning there, something that the securitization in regulation now generates from 2013. But also here, there are advanced, there are things that can help, integrate the capital market or the financial markets in.
Yeah. Good. So, Ben, do you want to add something?
No, I just want to say stay tuned because there's going to be some major announcements later this year. Like right now, the commission is working out to finalizing the details
Yeah.
on some of these proposals that they're going to be rolling out for the Savings and Investment Union. And as Willem said, it's going to focus on retail investors and securitization, and some other things like that. But there's going to be, you know, as this year rolls on, there's going to be announcements about this, about the clean industrial deal, about the affordable energy action plan. There's really a lot of work going on in Brussels right now because, there's a new administration in the U.S., but the commission is also still relatively new. And so like the main agenda points, the main legislative agenda, policy agenda is like going to be rolled out in the coming months.
Yeah, we actually, when we were in Brussels, Eden and I, we talked to Commissioner Sejourné and Ribeiro Rodriguez about them making a trip to the U.S. and talking to our audience about some of the announcements that you were just referencing. But let's go to competitiveness. I recently attended a program at Citi with Larry Summers, who stated flatly, but not in a necessarily negative way, that Fab number 8 will probably not come out of the EU. Mostly related, I mean, to some degree related to the situation of the financial markets, but also cultural and other more fundamental issues. What are the industries what are the industries of the future where the EU can stand out? I mean, what's coming across my table, I see biotech, I see medtech, life science more generally. Where is the EU on that? And I know we're trying to attract the scientists out of the US, but how is the EU doing in that space? Oh, I should also add defense, a very interesting innovation in the defense sector across Europe. What can we say about that?
Maybe I can do a quick answer on some of the competitiveness before we go to defense.
Yeah,
But just so a couple of things. One is that I think that the Draghi and Letta reports have really emphasized the need to boost productivity in Europe. And so that is like the thing that is framing all of these like detailed action plans and other reforms that you're hearing about. And when Americans hear about things like an omnibus proposal on simplification, they don't know what it means and it sounds odd, but like in fact people are going through like all the rule book that the EU has, all the common regulations, and trying to simplify things, make reporting requirements easier for businesses, make it so like the business environment itself is healthier and more competitive. But then those things get supplemented with what you might want to call sort of industrial policies, like the Critical Medicines Act, where the Commission played a big role in purchasing and distributing COVID vaccines during the pandemic. I think some of the efforts there building on this, that you have very strong pharmaceutical companies in Europe that everybody wants to leverage. And of course, there's always a lot of public funding of basic research in universities, and like human capital is ultimately where greater productivity and cutting edge businesses come from. But also this is also one of the things that we didn't mention about the Savings and Investment Union is they also want to take steps in Brussels to really nurture and encourage a venture capital industry in Europe, and to like enable there to be more capital for entrepreneurs and startup founders and stuff like that. But let me stop there because the defense stuff is also really a big deal.
yeah. I mean, but we get to that in greater detail later. What I've been seeing is really innovative. I mean, it's like I want to talk a little bit more about innovation because I do disagree with Larry on this. I mean, it may not be, the next internet or whatever, the next Facebook or whatever, TikTok, whatever we're doing there. But I'm seeing really interesting stuff coming out in biotech, around the use of certain technology in biotech to rethink how we're applying this technology. Then I'm seeing in the chemical sector a really innovative new material science and things like that. And I mean, really, high density, like really high-end technological, innovation where you need like dozens of engineers in a room, to develop this kind of technology. So I mean, it may not be a digital innovation, but there's so many other areas where Europe really stands out. Am I just like blinded European who thinks that, or do I know too many scientists and engineers?
Look, all of these are strategic sectors, right? And so
Yeah.
it's key that if you want to have a strong, highly productive, wealthy economy for the next 10, 20 years, you need to be in these areas. And I think everybody around the world understands that. And there's going to be competition coming from the United States and from China. And within Europe, in the single market, there's going to be a lot of companies fighting for market share. And this is essentially what you want, right? You want dynamic businesses who are competing hard with other companies to put out the best products and advance the cutting edge technologies.
Yeah. Willem, do you want to talk a little bit where we are with some of these reforms that we have started implementing a couple of years ago, and if there are any major accomplishments? You mentioned next generation EU, financing models, etc.
Yeah, I think there is that is very important here because it's clear that to go really use our potential, there will need to be structural reforms, and this has been on the radar screen for long. It's not just Draghi and Letta, but it's been there for ages. One of the things that's been done, major and big instrument, has been the 650 billion recovery fund, right? And this was a fund that had and that's still running until next year. And that combined investments together with reform. So that's the first thing I would want to mention. And so the whole you get rewarded. So as the member states get rewarded for doing reforms, structural reforms, like we've seen in financial markets, financial services, like anti-money laundering, but also active labor market policies. In the green sector, we've seen reforms and investment being combined, and we're now. So there's still some left. So the pressure is really on to also deliver on the other the remaining reforms. So that's one side, and then we have the reform of the public finances framework we have in the EU, of the implementation of that, and that also combines. But now more focused on macroeconomic level reforms. So and it's impressive. So what countries could do is say we need more time to adjust our public finances, which are already very much a stable source of stability compared to maybe other countries, the country we are in now. So they could say, well, we need a bit more time to get our public finance in line with the Stability Pact, this public finance framework, if you give us if we do reforms. And there we see again some really important reforms of unemployment benefits, for instance, in France, pension reforms. So that are significant reforms. So all these reforms are taking place on top of all the instruments that the EU has. And let's not forget that the EU budget is not much over 1% of EU GDP. So most of the effort has to be done at the national level, right? Yeah. And so this is I think the strategic changes that we see in the last years, in which there is an interaction between EU funding and EU rules and reaping the benefits in terms of increasing economic growth sustainable.
If I could jump in, one point I want to make about this forecast is that it actually does not include the impact of Germany's decision to invest, to get rid of the debt brake and to invest much more in defense and infrastructure. Nor does it have the impact of this national escape clause that is in the process of being activated to allow member states to invest more in defense. So these are two really big initiatives that are taking place sort of in cooperation between EU level institutions and the member states that are going to have an impact on growth, but also like specific impacts on investment in key strategic industries, especially defense.
Yeah. Do you want to continue on defense before we go back or in further detail on the energy markets?
You had a nice slide, Ben, on the...
Yeah, let me get the slide. Here we go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So who wants to get started on it? Ben?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to start on this.
Go ahead.
I suppose Ben doesn't want me to allow your name of a white paper, but there is a great policy initiative, and which falls in line with the EU scaling up its defense funding. That you can already see here in the forecast, but there's generally an inclination to increase expenditure. And there we have two sides actually again. So we have the national side and we have the EU central side. So you can't call it federal in the EU, but it's the central EU budget where we have this 150 billion SAVE instrument that is used also to integrate the defense system, because beyond, so to say, having to spend more or wanting to spend more, we also want to spend it wiser. Because, for instance, and this is an interesting thing I took from the forecast where we're talking about here, is the number of weapon system in the EU is over 5 times that of the US. So and it just shows that there's so many efficiency gains that can still be made. And then on top of that, you have the national escape clause, which would deliver the biggest chunk of this big number, 800 billion increase in expenditure. So that would be we would take into account when assessing the public finance of the individual member states. We are going to take into account their expenditures on defense. And then on to top that up, there's the EIB that's also making a shift, because the EIB could not invest in defense in the way it's going to do it right now. So that is the thing. Now, what does this mean for our forecast is the question, of course. And generally, I mean, it depends a lot on how you look at on what you spend it on. Because if you spend it on capital or you spend it on current expenditure on salaries, the impact is clearly different, and the impact is also different on productivity gains, not just the multiplier, but also the longer term growth. So that is one of the things that, if you go back one slide, then on the right hand you will see the graph, the different scenarios on what the impact would be, so to say, on longer term growth, and the lighter green one is the one where you have higher imports. For now, we still import quite a bit for our defense capital expenditures, but that could change, of course, depending also on strategic interactions. And the other one is, let's say, the higher the yellow, or the orange bar is about if you have higher productivity growth. If you manage to spend more on capital expenditure, and this tends to be more productive, then you could have a more positive impact. But I also have to say that the EU won the Nobel Peace Prize, that one EU institution won the Nobel Peace Prize, and was instance. And of course, this is not the best expenditure for an economy if you look away from, so to say, strategic necessities. I mean, the EU has always been spending quite a bit on development assistance, for instance, and yeah. So the stability expenses, so to say, are high. So to say, the international stability expenses are generally high also in the EU. Yeah.
I mean,
So
the thing is, I totally agree with you. It's not a good expense to invest, or it's not a good investment if you buy rockets, because they explode and then they don't have any use anymore. But I like to think, aside from the fact that we have a bit of a necessity here, that especially when you look at dual use innovation or products, that innovation sometimes comes out of the military and goes into the private sector. Other times it comes out of the private sector, goes into the public sector. So I think there's actually an innovation play that that could be really interesting for the European corporates, for the European economy as a whole. And I mean, what's going to be interesting to watch is also, if we are going to do this alone as Europe, this, rearming Europe, or if we're going to bring in some non-EU friends, among them, obviously, the UK. I think they're right now excluded in some of these initiatives. And but what about the Aussies, the Kiwis, and the Canadians? Because again, we have trade agreements with them.
I mean, I don't know that we can speak to that level of detail, but it is true that the EFTA countries are going to be able to participate in some of the joint procurement
Yeah.
and other stuff that's being talked about. So Norway and Switzerland, and probably the UK. But I mean, also, I don't think there's any reason to expect that the US won't remain a key supplier of some of these defense industrial complex goods. I don't think that we should exaggerate the breakdown in relations transatlantically. Like there historically, there's many times where the US and Europe have had slightly different interests and have had to negotiate some sort of path forward, and I don't think this is any different. But I do think it's worth emphasizing that particularly to an American audience, because I think this sometimes gets lost here, that it is actually Europe and not the United States that has been the largest contributor to Ukraine's defense in the war. I think the EU and member states together have contributed close to 150 billion euros in humanitarian and financial and military assistance altogether, which is more than the U.S. has done by a fair amount. I think the U.S. support has been around 100 billion or something like that. And all of these measures allowing, a lot of member states need to spend more on defense, in part because they have given a lot of their kit, a lot of their tanks and artillery and missiles. They've already passed them on to the Ukrainians who are using them. And so now there's a need for militaries to re-up their own supplies. And when they do that, they get the advantage of being able to buy modern, technologically up-to-date products and develop their own, industrial core that can produce some of these stuffs. And so I think, some of the hope here is that you're going to see more M&A activity within Europe amongst defense contractors. And you're going to see, as Willem was talking about before, in terms of the procurement, multiple countries buying similar weapon systems so that everything operates together. And you don't have problems of one military operating something that uses different ammunition from another military and all the logistical problems that creates. So this is all sort of part of a long-term plan of upgrading the capabilities of the European defense industry, because, while I think we can all agree that it would be better if the focus could be on peaceful use, Europe does live in a dangerous neighborhood, and there are security needs that need to be sorted.
Yeah, I agree. And I said that at another conference that I spoke at the other day. Europe and the US are not going to decouple. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, there's definitely a strain right now, but when we're so integrated, I don't even think it's possible if we wanted to. And I don't think that anybody wants to. But I think we covered, you covered my last question that I had on the defense spending, and maybe if we need to, we get back to that. I want to dive in a little bit more what's happening in the energy market, because I think that's also really, really interesting. Who wants to take a stab on where we are in that space, and developing how much energy are we importing, and what are we importing from where? Where are we on the energy transition? Where are we with energy market reforms?
Mhm.
Willem?
Yeah, so here, we touched on it shortly right now. Of course, this was the big shock, right? This was the different shocks we had, and that affected the European economy. The Russian invasion in the Ukraine, and the ensuing gas prices and energy price hikes. That was a real issue for the EU economy, much more than for any other economy, supposedly, or clearly. And it also meant that we had to shift our supplies, in particular for gas. So we reduced our gas imports from Russia by 80% already. But it's not an easy thing to move, but it has impacted. We all know how it impacted energy intensive industries I think in Germany, for instance, but across Europe, of course. But and the idea is to really get off the gas. So there you see a huge diversification, and for now, actually, it's almost half of the LNG that we take, that we now bring in from the US, and that could get more. Shevkovich has made the proposal that we buy more LNG from the US, just to try to seek a better balance in goods. Although, of course, when we're talking about trade balance, we also have to talk about service. But that is not about energy, right? You want to talk about energy. Then, of course, you see a feed in of the renewable energy sources. That is, I think, very, very important, also politically in the EU, because as much as we have a new college, the green transition is very close to our heart still. And there's a reason for that. The reason is, of course, climate change, first of all, and secondly, we are a big importer of energy. So luckily in oil, where it comes to oil, which is heavily used by the transport sector, for instance, we are much more diversified. That's much more easier. So I think overall, so looking at the diversification, we're doing pretty good, and we're happy, and we hope that we have stable partners also here in the US when it comes to the energy. What else can I say about that? We talked already about the need to integrate the energy market, and what huge benefits there could be for that. And this is an issue. I worked on Sweden before this, and you would not expect Sweden. Sweden had little exposure to Ukraine, either Ukraine or Russia, and still it was hugely impacted, and it saw the largest impact on its GDP. Why? Well, because actually energy price did go, but energy price went up so much, and because they relied on it went up so much, and so the central bank had to react, and then the interest rates went up, and then that was clear that there was a debt, household debt was an issue. So, just to say that energy is really at the core. this is a real change from, so to say, a few years ago, and we're now much less vulnerable, but still more needs to be done, and that's going to come in the year, well, 25, 26.
Yeah, and some of the energy reforms are already kicking in or have kicked in, and we're now benefiting from them as well.
Well, Europe has not backed away from its carbon commitments.
Yeah.
And a lot of the investments that were funded by the Recovery and Resilience Facility were especially directed towards the green transition. And you know, this covers a lot of things, from installing solar panels and windmills and things like that to better insulating houses and stuff. So it's sort of one of these comprehensive areas, but it's going to be more than that, because I think it's possible that you could see more nuclear in Europe. That's sort of a politically sensitive topic in some countries, but it seems like people are at least talking about it. And I think that, you know, this also plays into the discussion that we were having a while ago about rare earth minerals, that when you're really ramping up battery production, you need to have access to weird elements and compounds that I think people are going to find that there are larger supplies and more geographically diverse locations of these supplies than currently is the case. And once that happens, you're going to see production ramp up, and you're going to see huge advances in battery technology in the coming years that, you know, again, this is one of these strategic sectors that everybody wants to be a part of, and have their own production capacity and help push the technological envelope. So Europe is moving full steam ahead in that regard.
Yeah, my famous sodium batteries, the Go Sodium. We have only like 5 or so minutes left. A fiscal outlook and for the EU and financial conditions. We addressed a number of things already. Inflation, debt, the Schuldenbremse, and maybe in that regard, if one of you wants to talk quickly, and I know we're not necessarily talking about specific countries, but on my mind is France. We need France to invest, and they have you know, a bit of a budget crisis, but with European money, can they make it? Are you willing to say something about that?
I mean, sure. I think, you know, broadly in average terms, the fiscal stance across the EU is going to be broadly neutral in the next 2 years. So, and as I said, this forecast doesn't include Germany's reforms to the debt brake or the national escape clause. So it's conceivable that deficits will be a little bit higher than we anticipate here, and there might be a little bit more of a fiscal impulse, not that much. And so this is important, though, because as you see in some of the volatility in financial markets, investors are becoming a little bit concerned about the U.S. sustainability of the U.S. fiscal path. And they're pushing up long-term interest rates in the treasury bond market in the United States. And while Europe is not totally exempt from that, because, you know, global financial flows matter, rates, you know, have not gone up as much in Europe as in the United States. And I think that what we're seeing here is an effort to strike a balance between the obvious need to make more investment and keeping fiscal on a sustainable path. And so that's what all of these reforms are keeping in mind in the back of people's head, is that, like, yes, we need to invest in the green transition. We need to have more defense spending. We need to make reforms that will boost productivity, and that requires investments in human capital and infrastructure and things like this. But you still need to do so in a reasonable, sustainable way. So, you know, I think there were 11 member states last year that were running deficits above 3%, and one of those countries was definitely France. But there's, you know, countries have a lot of flexibility to decide where, countries maintain their own fiscal policies, their own tax and spending measures. And so within the context of the rules, which are being loosened a little bit, they have a lot of choices as to how to direct those funds to the most productive measures. And I think this is one of the things that Willem was talking about too, is that the interesting part of the Recovery and Resilience Facility as a tool is that it offered EU money for investment. So it had this big carrot that here's this big pot of money that you can gain access to. But in return, there was also a bit of a stick that you have to make some of the structural reforms that are going to unleash the productive potential of your economy in order to get at this money. And the money itself has to be directed in areas that is going to have a long-term payoff.
Yeah, I mean, the EU
Willem, if you
definitely
want to add.
smartened up without a question. We have a question from the audience that I think is interesting. How is the EU going to equalize the various deficit sizes amongst member states? Is that a problem, or because I mean, I'm looking at the slide that you have up, and how worried are you about some member states having huge deficits, others not so much? How are they going to find their place in the EU?
Well, having spent 16 years in Brussels and 9 years in a frugal country, I have to say, of course, it's terrible. But at the same time, I think we got our system in place. It's not for nothing that we kind of had this overhaul of the budgetary framework, where we focus, so to say, where we focus on the net expenditure path. So we keep the end goal of sustainable finances that meet the requirements from Maastricht, so the 60% and the 60% debt to GDP and a 3% deficit. But now what is the innovation is that you have, so every country has an individual net expenditure path, so as to insulate it from cyclical movements. But these are in line with these requirements for sustainable finances. And then you have to see separately, so to say, from the 4 years of additional expenditures that fall under the national escape clause for defense.
Yeah, and just to add, it's worth remembering that the overall debt to GDP ratio in the EU has fallen by close to 10%, 9 or 10% since 2020. And so even as, the European member states have been running, fiscal deficits, budget deficits on an annual basis, even so, the debt to GDP ratio has been coming down. I think that this speaks to how, on the one hand, the fiscal rules are working, but on the other hand, this is important because the cost of carrying this debt, interest rate expenditures as a budget item, they're about 2% of GDP in Europe, and this is less than half of what the U.S. is paying to cover the interest payments on the debt. And so there is fiscal space in Europe, and it's being managed in a way that actually takes budget projections seriously, and you have like adults in the room, so to speak, making sure that countries are not making decisions that put their fiscal on wildly unsustainable paths.
Yeah, you're absolutely right to point that out. I mean, there's no shame in running debt if you need to invest, but obviously the debt needs to be under control so that you're not being drowned in debt payment. On the fiscal outlook, a final word before we close up, or in general, do you want to make a final statement about the fiscal and financial conditions and the challenges?
I just stopped sharing, just so if you're wondering. I don't know, Willem, should we say something on this?
Yeah, I mean, we can go back to the start of what you were presenting. There was positive momentum in the EU economy after these big shocks, and that also translated in, it was also a disinflationary process, so that interest rates could come down a bit, and so the that also gives maybe some space later on, although of course this is not within the net expenditure path. What I would want to say, so to say, is that there are sometimes questions whether you can invest, so to say, in EU debt instruments, and there is now one which is for the, that's for the RF, for the recovery fund, and a bit for the MFA. It's not a big thing if you're talking about integrated financial bond market in the EU. But so there is this instrument, and it has a slight spread over bonds. Yeah, I don't know. What do you want to add to that, Ben?
Well, I mean, just to say that to reiterate what we were saying at the outset, where Europe is not going to let this crisis go to waste. And I think that one of the things about this latest crisis of trade protectionism and uncertainty that we're facing is that, unlike some of previous crises that we've gone through, this one really highlights some of the underlying strengths of Europe. You know, it's a developed, rich place with lots of very well-educated people, lots of sophisticated businesses, prudent management of fiscal policies, and that's not to say that there aren't structural factors that need to be addressed, but people are working on them, and that is the sense in which Europe is going to take advantage of this crisis by proving that it's a safe, reliable partner that is open for business and that has lots of opportunities.
Yeah, and also for American companies. No? I mean, we said that in the beginning. There is investment. We see it in the markets, in the German market, the French markets. Investors are buying up German equity. So it's definitely also the investment in the euro. And I don't know if you want to go into reserve currencies or not, maybe not at this a program because we're a little bit over time. But yeah, the message is really we are a reliable partner in uncertain times. And we need to work together. We're the largest economies and our longest trade partners with one another. And we rely on each other for innovation and other financial support, etc. So I would say outlook altogether in terms of the EU's ability to stand up and say, hey, we're here to help. Definitely 2 thumbs up, no?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And if anybody who's been listening to today or wants to follow up with any more questions or things that they want to know about Europe, you know, you can get in touch with Yvonne. She can pass the messages on to us. We're happy to help.
Very good. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Willem. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. There are a number of programs that we have in the pipeline. You can find them on our website. The topics include AI, M&A activity. We're going to have Roberta Metsola, the President of the European Parliament, visiting us. We have a couple of programs on visa or immigration-related issues. So do join us for future programs. And Ben and Willem, we see you back with the fall, autumn, I should say, forecast, if not before.
Absolutely. Thanks very
Looking
much for
forward.
having us, Yvonne.
Yeah,
Thank you, everybody.
Great experience. Thanks.
See you. Ta-ta.
Ciao.